Hello, so today I'm going to talk to you about community information networks, specifically surrounding anti-predator networks in mobbing. So mobbing is a behavior where prey, like this great tit, will see a predator, like a sparrowhawk, and will begin to harass and attack it in order to drive it from the area. And the calls that these species produce during these behaviors often have information about the predators themselves in it. And it's not just conspecifics that can understand this information, but heterospecifics as well, even those species that are not very closely related. And I wanted to understand how all of these species fit into these large communication networks about predators. How the eavesdroppers are actually eavesdropping on this information, and how the information sources, or those species that are initiating mobbing events and putting this information in their calls, are actually used by the community, and how reliable and useful they are. So to do this, I induced mobbing in these birds by presenting them with robotic taxidermy mounts of a control, a low-threat buzzard, and a high-threat sparrowhawk. And first, I really wanted to understand, when we look at these eavesdropping species, do they actually rely on this information, or can they put this information that they eavesdrop on in their own calls? And what we found is that eavesdropping species can differentiate between controls or non-threatening birds versus threatening predators. They did not, however, differentiate between high-threat predators and low-threat predators. So we think that they do actually rely on the information produced by these other species that are thought to be sources of information. So when we look at sources of information, like tit species, for example, there's this idea that some of them may be community informants or particularly good at providing information to the entire community. So we wanted to see if any of these 6 tit species were actually community informants. To be a community informant, you not only need to have good, reliable information, so information that differentiates between predators of high and low threat, that information needs to be reliable across mobbing events. So every single time you mob a high-threat predator, you need to put that information in your calls the same way, regardless of how big the flock is or what other species are present. And finally, to be a community informant, you need to be eavesdropped on by multiple species in the community, not just one. So we looked at these 6 tit species, and we found that 5 of them actually encode this information in their calls very well, so they differentiate between these different predators. Only 3 of them, however, coal tits, blue tits, and great tits, put this information in their calls reliably across mobbing events, regardless of flock size and composition. And then finally, we found that only one species, the great tit, is actually eavesdropped on by multiple other species in the community, meaning that the great tit is the only species that actually fits into this idea of a community informant. So with that, I'd like to thank my lab and my funding sources and the people that let me conduct my experiments on their land.